thing is about the sea is that you disappear without a trace. There's nothing left. You can't be found. It is a true disappearance.
Somebody wrote that Bas Jan had said that he would disappear for 3 years and then return. I didn't believe that that was what he was doing ever, but in the back of my head, I thought, well, I'll give him 3 years and then he'll be dead, for sure. I couldn't stop crying for years.
It had been 30 years since Mary Sue Ader saw her husband disappear behind the horizon in pursuit of a masterpiece the world would remember him by. He called his journey In Search of the Miraculous, but to this day the true nature of Bas Jan Ader's quest remains one of the great mysteries of the art world. In the spring of 2005, Mary Sue asked me to make a movie about Bas Jan, in the hope that I could shed some light on the artist's life, thanks to our shared history. I drove out to see her in the Inland Empire, 50 miles outside LA, where the houses serve as shelter from the scorching desert sun and the dogs bark once a day when the mailman stops by. Mary Sue's instructions were as follows.
The right approach is to interview all these cohorts and family members and see what they have to say, and then try some other routes into understanding them, because I don't think what they have to say is going to give you a lot. So you have to trust your own instincts, because the tie between you and him is really strong.
Retracing the Dutch artist's footsteps brought me back to the country we both left behind. A flat land below sea level where Calvinism has been thriving for centuries. Following a long tradition of artists leaving Holland, Bas Jan and I had immigrated at an early age to California, where he would make his art films, and I joined the movie industry. He became known for his explorations of gravity, while I explored gravity models in virtual reality. We both married artists who produced our films. And perhaps most significantly, both of us were the archetypal sons of idealistic teachers and ministers hailing from the high north of Holland. His father preached and played the organ in this church, 10 miles from the German border, which is where I began my search for Bas Jan Ader. Today, no services are held in the church, as it just sits there, preserved as a monument to Bas Jan's heroic parents. During World War II, Bas Jan Ader Sr. became a resistance hero, saving numerous Jews from certain death in the German extermination camps. Following his father's execution by the Nazis, his mother took over the pulpit and had high hopes that her eldest son would someday do the same. I was told that Bas Jan's mother was buried in the cemetery beside the church, but her name was nowhere to be found. This was perhaps a good thing, considering that she would have turned over in her grave had she found out that across from the church now stands a brothel, catering to, of all people, the Germans. I connected with some neighbors who expressed their concerns about the artist's ill-fated exploits.
Bas Jan Ader, dat had niet gemoeten. Die wou in een notendop over de oceaan. Ja. Dat was iemand, hij woonde in Amerika, hè? Ja, dat was hij heette net als zijn vader.
Dat is mijn broer.
I visited a school friend of Bas Jan's in the hope of further revelations.
Ik zou zeggen, zoek u een stoel op.
Daalder.
Nou, ik heb Bas Jan leren kennen op de ULO-school, waar we dus samen heen fietsten. Maar dat ging in een dermate hoog tempo, dat wij dus geen tijd hadden om te converseren.
Years later, he went to see a retrospective of his old friend's work, which he reconstructed in his own roundabout way.
Ja, hij had een film gemaakt over zijn leven in Amerika. Dan zag je hem dus in een boom klimmen, boven een sloot. En nou, het was eigenlijk voorspelbaar dat hij tak kon afbraken. Het zat hem vaak tegen. Hij had vaak dingen die dan toch weer heel anders liepen dan hij verwacht had.
According to the town's collective memory, Bas Jan's life was the bad luck story of a prodigal son who never returned from his journey. A journey that started out in Amsterdam, where he studied art at the Rietveld Academy together with his friend Ger van Elk.
Being at the art school, he made a drawing, and that was like a small sheet of 50 by 60 centimeters white paper. And drawing classes, he always made a drawing on that same sheet. He never threw it away, but used the same sheet and always used then the eraser. You know, it's like, oh my God, I saw making a drawing, so it's not good. You know, so he erased, and he erased next week, and the week after, and the week after. Still the same piece of paper. And at the end, he used the eraser so much that it was not a drawing anymore. It was like a piece of paper that you could look through. That really, for me, is the icon of Bas Jan.
Years later, Van Elk's metaphor could just as soon be applied to Bas Jan's life, which in just a few decades had become almost impossible to reconstruct. As it turns out, time is the biggest eraser of them all. Even his house, once the site of so much of his work, has now made place for a barren plot of land. And Bas Jan's widow Mary Sue has long since moved 20 minutes down the road. When I went to visit her to dig up some mementos of Bas Jan's life, it turned out that the artist's legacy was threatening to be completely overwhelmed by layers of more recent memories, to be haphazardly excavated by the resilient widow and yours truly. Explain to us what happened here, like in all these rooms and the garage and so on. Like the whole past kept compiling.
Yeah.
Like, and you never ever revisited any of it.
I've tried not to.
I mean, you carry all of this along with you, and everybody goes on and on and on about this legacy, and here it is, sort of like we have to salvage it from under like piles and piles of clothes and stuff, and rats in the drawer, and indeed, like the people in Holland, you know, like they would go crazy. The most proper people in the world. I remember we could.
They would think that, oh yeah, that's why she's that way. She's all depressed, or she's all like, let everything go, you know, that kind of thing.
Depressed even.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's what they would probably think. Mess is equal to depressed, or not quite handling things very well.
Right.
And it's probably partly that, but not totally.
Finding mementos of Bas Jan's life was like digging for treasure. Here's what we found. A picture of Bas Jan's parents. The house where they were hiding Jewish people during World War II. A photo album of those whose lives they saved. Bas Jan was his father, a few months before he was executed by the Nazis. And here was his mother, age 3. His younger brother Eric, who never got to know their father. Mary Sue, the American girl he fell in love with. Their wedding in Las Vegas. Shots from an exhibition at Claremont College. Bas Jan's graduation picture, together with his friend Bill Levitt. And here's the announcement of his final journey, in search of the miraculous. The documentation of someone's life, by definition, falls painfully short. There are all these thoughts and feelings and sudden insights that people experience, of which no record remains. Unless perhaps that person is an artist. But the oeuvre Bas Jan left behind was extremely small. A substantial part of it was made in just one single weekend. All we have is a handful of his films, a dozen photographs and installations, and a few performance pieces. And all the artist himself had to say about it was that when he fell, gravity made itself master over him, and when he cried, it was because of extreme grief. Which turned out to be a familiar sentiment to his survivors, who found out the hard way how difficult it is to truly get to know another human being.
Well, Too Sad is a beautiful piece because it means that you cannot actually say what you want to say. It's difficult for anybody. I mean, the loneliness of being in your own soul, there is no way out. Not for you, not for me, not for him. I am too sad to tell you means I cannot tell you, and it is making me very sad. And what is it that you cannot tell me? Well, everything.
The problem with art and his art, I mean, now you ask me to verbalize something that if he could have verbalized it, he would have been a writer. I mean, he was expressing himself by other means. And that was also indeed sort of to some extent the problem when we tried to talk about his art, that he was rather unwilling to sort of verbalize it.
The problem I kept running into was that Bas Jan was an enigma, even to those who had been close to him. On one of my recurring visits to see Bill Levitt, he confessed that by now the memory of his friend had all but disappeared behind the myth.
All right, well, come in. You're here.
All right, okay. New
Yeah,
paintings.
some new paintings.
Oh,
Totally. Yeah.
good stuff.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now there's a secret in either.
The secret, yeah, that's not revealed. Possible.
So there we go, the secret not revealed. That's my job here with Bas Jan
That's your
Ader.
job.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
What might that secret be?
I don't know. You know, I mean, I see this picture of him on the bike, and I think, what is this person? You know, see, I recognize the face, but I don't. You know, it's like somebody else all of a sudden. I think also at the time when we were friends, I had no idea that I was friends with a myth.
Well, it's true that the people who knew him and who were there, in a way, are the least helpful in the understanding of Bas Jan.
Uh-huh.
So I almost had to put myself there and not knowing him, and saying like, well, I wager he was kind of like this.
But that's good. I mean, you're part of the search. I think it'll come to you when you least expect it.
One of the few things Bas Jan ever said about his work was that it was an unfolding narrative. But according to one of his final artworks, a lot was left unsaid and then forgotten, leaving it up to us to fill in the blanks. Bill suggested that I should take a close look at my own past, searching for clues in our shared history. Like Bas Jan, I was born in the high north, on an island with nothing but horizon wherever you would look, where we were dreaming of the same distant shores we would end up moving to later in life. So this is where it all began, and this is what I call home. The amazing thing, of course, is there is such a place still for me, whereas Bas Jan, to the extent that he ever tried to get home in his final journey, it's this perfect example of the American saying that you can't go home again, that there isn't such a place anymore after you emigrated. Revisiting my own birthplace, I was reminded how similar it was to where Bas Jan came from. An outpost at the far reaches of the Netherlands, where the locals had adopted American farming techniques and the Voice of America was broadcasting jazz from its military bases. Just a stone's throw from both his old house and mine lies the sea, the gateway to the romantic elsewhere that beckoned Bas Jan throughout his life. Here is always somewhere else. It's a line that I love by Bas Jan, and it's actually very, very typical for those who grow up near the ocean. The sea, of course, represents the great unknown that lies beyond the horizon. It's an uncharted region, both geographically and spiritually. In essence, something that makes it almost impossible to not have this romantic mindset that Bas Jan's work seems to be so informed by.
He was trying to find what cannot be found. He was trying to, in that sense, shift boundaries. He was walking on the edge, seriously trying to see behind the horizon. That's where he's so utterly romantic. Even though you know you won't be able to look behind the horizon, you continue to do so.
But romanticism was hardly the artistic currency of the time. In 1963, one of Bas Jan's classmates at the Rietveld Academy, Wim T. Schippers, had an entirely different take on the ocean.
Wim T. Schippers, voor wiens academical works ook van buitenlandse zijde belangstelling bestaat, maakt werken voor alle zintuigen. De gazeuzen bij petten zouden wij misschien het beste een soort feitkunst kunnen noemen. In plaats van met verf en linnen werkt hij met het stellen van feiten. In dit geval is het kunstwerk dus niet een schilderij of een gedicht, maar het legen van een flesje limonade bij petten.
Irony prevailed in Dutch culture, and Wim Schippers was its most visible artistic promoter, along with Fluxus artist Willem de Ridder. They organized a march through Amsterdam for no apparent purpose.
In samenwerking met de Association for Scientific Research in New Methods of Recreation, de Efsrinmore International, organiseerden Willem de Ridder en Wim T. Schippers de Mars door Amsterdam.
Schippers announced plans for additional marches elsewhere in the world.
Er zullen meerdere marsen volgen door Parijs, Londen, New York en Tokio.
But this too was a put-on. Because while the rest of the world was celebrating pop art, Holland's art scene had invented a brand of irony all its own. Such as tulips, which held the audience in suspense for several minutes, before it finally climaxed with a single falling flower petal. And Willem de Ridder's film Bon Appetit, which celebrated the perverse rituals of the bourgeoisie. Or Ger van Elk, taking on pointless challenges. But Bas Jan's work was different. Its romantic hopelessness reminds us more of this film by the Belgian artist Marcel Broodhaars, whose Letter in the Rain was washed away as quickly as Bas Jan's art had vanished with the help of his eraser. As it turns out, setting oneself up for failure would forever haunt Bas Jan's work.
I still remember where in Amsterdam he walked around, it was around the southern part of town, and Bas didn't know what to present for his exam. He had to do some kind of three-dimensional piece. And so he picked up a few bricks and put one on top of the other, so it's quite without any expression. And of course, more wonderful thing was that he didn't have the cement, he didn't make that right. And by the time we got to the table where we had to put our pieces on top, on the table, it fell apart. So it was there with two bricks. I thought it was wonderful.
Wonderful, perhaps, but Bas Jan failed his exam and left art school. It wasn't the first time he failed, his brother told me.
He failed in school, he failed in the art academy, and so yeah, what's the next step? I mean, I think he was 17, and sort of this so far was obviously not a success story and very problematic. And he went on an exchange program, I think found by my mother with a Christian background, and of course there was always hope that one day she would return this black sheep back to the flock.
Sent by his mother to a Christian exchange program in Washington, the black sheep tasted instant success. He sold one of his artworks to Jacqueline Kennedy. the Voice of America covered the event.
Bas Jan Ader, a talented young exchange student from the Netherlands, is climaxing his year in the United States with a one-man art show at Washington's Galerie Réalité, a distinction many artists never achieve. The money the youth receives will be saved for a long-planned project. After he returns to the Netherlands, he wants to go into seclusion for a year to paint and study.
But returning home from America, the overnight success had already outgrown the Dutch provinces.
At that time he didn't relate to it. He related to the States, and he was blatantly unhappy being there. I mean, in the early days of his return, he would draw the curtains not to have to see the grey skies.
Around that same time, a group of young filmmakers made their first movie. That's me there as a female nurse, being picked up by my scriptwriting partner Rem Koolhaas, who played my boyfriend. Documentarian Frans Bromet, who we'll see more of later, played an unhappy, overgrown toddler. And fellow immigrant Jan de Bond was modeling underwear. Playful as our first efforts may have been, all of us would turn out to be a bit too brash and cocky for the self-effacing Dutch.
...19 oktober 1969. De wereld is in mist verpakt, maar Schiphol draait door. Vlucht KL 214 is geland. Het is 12:35 als de jonge dynamische Nederlandse filmregisseur René Daalder uit een sombere lucht komt vallen.
René Daalder, je komt net uit Hamburg. Wat heb je daar gedaan?
Mijn film had gemaakt.
Hoe heet die film?
De Blanke Slavin.
Wat kost de film?
Heel erg veel. Ik weet wel zeker dat het de duurste film is die hier in Nederland ooit gemaakt is in ieder geval.
Kan je zeggen hoe het komt dat juist jij deze film mag maken, de duurste film in Nederland?
Ik ben tamelijk duur, hè. Ik zou of geen film maken of een dure. Kennelijk kan het allemaal in Nederland toch. En ik denk dat ik beter ben dan de meeste Nederlandse filmmakers, eerlijk gezegd.
At the movie's premiere, confusion bordered on chaos. The critics liked the film, but the audience, lured by the promise of its sexy title, was baffled by the film's relentless artiness and stayed away in droves.
Ik begrijp niet dat de Heer niet al lang een tweede zondvloed over de mensheid heeft gestort. Als ik hem was.
One week later, I had packed my bags and left, before my fellow countrymen had a chance to cut me down to size. A few years earlier, Bas Jan had done the same, as he hitchhiked to Spain and ended up in Morocco, where he signed up as a deckhand on a yacht headed for America.
So there was this yacht, and with the skipper who oozed competence and said yes, no, he would sail the boat back, but he needed just one other guy, and it was a placard on the boat, crew wanted. And Bas Jan thought, hey, hang on, crew wanted, well, I can at least go across the Atlantic, and if they don't want me, then I'll go back again.
And so Bas Jan handed over his sailor's permit. Inside it was a note written by his mother. It read, Mrs. J.A. Ader Appels gives her son, Bastiaan Johan Christian Ader, permission to go to sea. And that's what he did, as the next day he sailed off to California.
De dag van vertrek is de mooiste dag. Dan laat je alles achter je en als je het land niet meer ziet, kan je niks meer overkomen. Kan je gewoon niks meer gebeuren. Het gevoel krijg ik direct al. En je komt in een toestand waarin je altijd wilt blijven. Het bevalt je daar, je hebt het glazen niet aan je hoofd, je bent een druppel in de oceaan, je bent één van het universum en je schip ga je schepen. Je wordt een geheel.
Henk de Velde knows what he's talking about. He sailed 5 times around the world and spent years of his life at sea escaping the land. Like many other solo sailors whose minds have been expanded by the vastness of the ocean.
I think there's only a certain person that would do a journey like that, because it's such a confrontation with the cosmos, with the out there, that it becomes a test of their very soul. Do you know what I mean? It's something much more profound than just a test of, you know, their bravura.
Tassie Tadine first discovered Bas Jan Ader as she was making a film about Donald Crowhurst, the legendary British solo sailor who faked his logbooks during a race around the world. Just like Bas Jan, Crowhurst disappeared at sea without leaving a trace of his earthly existence, except for his boat, which would become the subject of Tassita's film Teignmouth's Electron. There are many accounts of men who, once they have taken to the ocean, have lost their desire to return to land. Like Joshua Slocum, who spent his entire life at sea, where he finally disappeared. Or French sailor Bernard Moitaché, who denounced the pettiness of the land, and at sea found humility and truth in what he referred to as the fourth dimension. But Bas Jan was not a solo sailor yet. He still had to cross 2 oceans while battling epic storms and mountainous waves in a journey that was to become more about destiny than about the destination itself. When the boat finally shipwrecked off the coast of California, a full-blown sailor had emerged. The Los Angeles Bas Jan and I had moved to was an artificial oasis in the desert, an earthquake-prone stretch of arid land with no natural water supply, where developers were raking in the money by selling endless parcels of cheap land. There was no dare there, as the saying goes. It was a million miles from home.
It was on the brink of the point where when people went to North America, they emigrated and you probably would never see them again. And maybe one day when they had made it rich in the States, they would have enough dollars to pay for a round trip back to Europe to at least sort of see their parents before they would die.
Hollywood was also not what one would expect today. No one even bothered to keep up its famous landmarks and backlots because there was no tourism at the time. The place was a mere ghost town, a dusty old dream factory, catering to our collective desire to escape into myth. An ocean and an entire continent away from home, Bas Jan and I settled among the drifters and the desperados who populated the streets of Hollywood. There were times when the two of us lived just a few blocks apart, even on the same street, but our paths never crossed. I lived in the Hollywood Tower, where I was working on a screenplay about how the films of the future would be made in the computer, an idea that was considered entirely preposterous by the studios at the time. Bas Jan gave it a good try at art school, where he made some pieces in the style of British pop art and studied philosophers like Wittgenstein and Kant, putting himself completely at odds with the local California art scene.
American art, and I think this was particularly true of Los Angeles, had a very strongly masculine quality to it, and it was really what we wanted, what we were interested in, and Bas Jan complicated that a little bit. The works that involved him crying, photographic works, seemed like a very overt reference to the kind of emotionalism that we thought we were trying to get away from.
What Tom is really trying to say here is that Bas Jan was European, a role the artist apparently played up to the hilt.
You looked like John Paul Belmondo, you know, and you wore the all blue and he had blue cigarettes and dark blue shoes even. And our joke was we were going to buy him a shirt for his birthday, and it was going to be a dark blue shirt. We're going to ask him if he liked the color. That was, yeah. And the girls just thought he's the cutest guy. They just thought he's the most romantic, handsome artist they'd ever seen.
The girl he picked was Mary Sue, the daughter of the director of Otis Art Institute, where both of them were students.
He came up to me for the very first time and lifted his shirt up and said, "I've got one of the 5 most beautiful belly buttons in the world." And so that's how I met Bas Jan, and instantly fell in love, of course, because how many people do you have saying that to you?
Their wedding in Las Vegas was classic Bas Jan.
Bas wanted to film it, so he went off and got a camera, and then we went to the Justice of Peace and got married. And Bas had brought a crutch along so he could be married on a crutch. That was really hysterical, I thought. I thought it was really appropriate for Bas to do that because he really needed it. It wasn't the favorite thing he was going to do that year.
Bas Jan had done the all-American thing. He got himself a home in the suburbs, a pretty wife and a dog, effectively reinventing himself in the image of middle-class America. Mary Sue was an art teacher at the local college, and Bas Jan studied art and philosophy and would become a teacher too. For a while there, it seemed like the black sheep had finally lived up to the expectations of his parents. Days before he was shot to death by the Nazis, Bas Jan's father wrote a letter to his mother, saying, "If we do not see each other again, and Europe continues to be as dark a place as it is today, you should go to America." And now his son had made it all the way to the New World. Yet his mind kept wandering back to the darkness of his parents' Europe.
Here, California, with a lovely wife who comes home in a German car, and I who fit in and watch movies of the Second World War. The loud splashing rains of those Netherlands are flooding my subconscious. Calmly the bicycle fathers, distinguished, erect, sink into the greyness of 2 wheels. To keep myself from cycling at some future time with honorable fathers amongst leaden clouds, I declared myself pure and felt almost holy upon having done so.
Once again, here was always somewhere else. In a beautiful untitled film, Bas Jan appears to be scanning the horizon, like a stranded sailor trying to flag down passing ships from his desert island in the suburbs. Yet he gradually settled in as the student became a teacher and the American dream a reality. But there were signs in Bas Jan's work that he questioned the comfort of his middle-class existence.
There's a characteristic, I think, in academia in general, and perhaps in art teaching in particular, that's very self-hating and anti-professional. That if you've got a tenured job, that you've done something wrong. You've sort of betrayed the role of the true artist. You've turned your back on it. And so I think he took that paradox of having a regular paycheck and being able to get his car serviced instead of towed, and being able to pay the rent without worrying about those things. And he dealt with it on the one hand with a sense of guilt. That's my theory. And on the other hand, a sense that it's something that should be folded over and turned into his art.
So one day, Bas Jan brought his chair out of the kitchen and up to the roof to make his first fall. By the time Bas Jan hit the ground, the artist had found his medium of choice, gravity. Gravity is the elemental force that governs every aspect of our lives. It is the challenge we meet when we make our first steps, and it strikes us down when our life's journey finally comes to an end. In gravity, some may feel the hand of God, or the organizing principle of the universe, while to others it represents the thrill of life, or the absurdity of our existence.
Als ik iets mag zeggen over Bas Jan Ader, ik kende hem eigenlijk niet. En toen kon ik me herinneren dat ik 20, 30 jaar geleden eens op de televisie in Nederland zag een man die de gracht in fietste. En ik dacht toen dat het een komiek was. Nu ben ik met hem bezig geweest. Het moment dat hij fietst is niet belangrijk. Het moment dat hij in het water valt is niet belangrijk. Het moment van de val ook niet. Het moment dat hij loslaat. Hij liet zich ook van het dak vallen. Het rollen is niet belangrijk, de val ook niet. Maar dat tiende van een seconde dat daartussen zit, loslaten. Die tiende van een seconde. Hij wil het eeuwige leven in dat loslaten. Het liefst zou hij blijven in het moment dat hij van de dak afrolt en zich loslaat. Maar ja, je valt.
Besides being a fall artist, Bas Jan was also a storyteller. We had something in common there. Look how he's snuffing out one thing after another in this piece called Light Vulnerable Objects Threatened by 8 Cement Bricks. It's a classic 10 Little Indian story. Lots of action, a high body count. Just the way Hollywood likes them. I should know. My first film in America followed the same time-honored recipe for success.
David, what do you think is going on?
I think obviously somebody in this school is insane.
Like a psychopathic killer?
Yeah, I guess so.
It was called Massacre at Central High, and it was my job to kill a slew of high school kids for the edification of the drive-in movie crowd. I threw myself into the project, but not without negotiating an unusual twist. They asked for guns, but I gave them gravity as the killer's weapon of choice. And in the best tradition of American B-movies, there were even light, vulnerable objects. Threatened by 8 rocky boulders. There were signs of Bas Jan's Americanization as well, as he came up with the sensational concept to shoot himself in the leg with a handgun. But at the last minute, the project was preempted by a student at Irvine College, who famously had himself shot in the arm. His name was Chris Burden, and at times his work curiously intersected with that of Bas Jan. Burden staged his own disappearance in the Gulf of Mexico, and his recent project about a radio-controlled ghost ship reminds us of Bas Jan's boat, which made it all the way to Europe with no one at the helm. One might even perceive a subtle sort of parallel between Chris Burden becoming a modern-day Christ by having himself crucified to the back of a Volkswagen, and the suffering of Christ many an art historian has read into I'm Too Sad to Tell You. Yet it's not the similarities between Chris Burden and Bas Jan that are of interest to our film, but the vast cultural differences between the visceral American artist and the heady European.
I didn't quite understand him. I mean, here's someone who thinks America is fantastic, but won't allow himself to be completely American, you know, to have to hold on to this Dutchness.
It seems that only the Dutch can understand the deep love-hate relationship with the country's Calvinist roots that is shared by Bas Jan's favorite authors, like Reeve and W.F. Hermans, and some of Holland's most famous painters who had to leave their native country in order to find themselves. But even abroad, most of them remain Dutch at the core, like Piet Mondrian, who was the subject of several of Bas Jan's works. Let's listen in on an artistic conversation between Bas Jan and the modernist Dutch master. The lighthouse at the end of the road was a landmark in Mondrian's development as an artist, as his work evolved from abstract expressionism into primary colors and straight lines, which he considered the perfect expression of harmony and order. Now look how Bas Jan uses his body in a dialogue with the Dutch master. In the 1930s, Mondrian had a lifelong falling out with his friend, the architect Theo van Doesburg, who instead of Mondrian's straight lines, came to favor the diagonal as an expression of a more dynamic worldview. Here's how Bas Jan tried to settle that typical Dutch argument. Today, there are quite a few young European artists whose work has engaged in a similar artistic dialogue with Bas Jan himself.
Somebody told me that I really should check out the work of Bas Jan Ader, and I saw all his films, and I was totally astounded. For me, it felt like, really like coming home, like somebody that I finally met somebody or a person that understood me.
I was studying at Rietveld Academy, and I was painting all my personal belongings in one big tableau. And somebody advised me to have a look at the work of Bas Jan because he put all his clothes on the roof. I liked this aspect of the work, that it was very personal.
The first relationship I ever had with him was when I borrowed Farewell to Faraway Friends, which I showed with my film called Disappearance at Sea.
Inspired by Bas Jan, Tacita made a film about an old Dutch wave machine built many years ago to study the behavior of the sea.
For me, that was about containing the sea, making it land, in a way like the Dutch do.
The machine was once used as a tool in Holland's never-ending struggle with the water. The same is true for Holland's famous windmills, like the one in Eric's film, which was originally used to drain the water from the soggy land the Dutch reclaimed from the sea. Living below sea level, the Dutch are always just moments away from drowning. It's a recurring theme in Bas Jan's work and inspired Lonnie to make this film.
I made two allegorical works in which I used the Hermes statue. And Hermes is the messenger god, so he's connecting the metaphysical world and the earth. And in the first scene, he's tumbling out of the metaphysical world into the ocean. Then a female swimmer, that's myself, comes to try to keep him afloat or to rescue him.
In her attempt to rescue Hermes, it was as if Lonnie was trying to save Bas Jan himself. In order to deliver him back into the metaphysical realm, she embarked on an epic journey.
I made another film in which I dragged the sculpture from Amsterdam to the caves in Lascaux. Lascaux is the place where the first man-made images were found, and at that time, image had a religious meaning. So I dragged it from Amsterdam through Germany, through France. It was a very long journey, and the sculpture wore off slowly. So it started as a big figure, but at the end it was nearly dematerialized. In a way, I brought back the sculpture to the spiritual, dematerialized world.
The artistic appreciation of Bas Jan's work almost 30 years after he embarked on his final homebound journey, was remarkable. It certainly hadn't always been that way. In 1971, Bas Jan was invited to participate in a major Dutch group show, but the reception back home had been far from a hero's welcome. The only review of his work in a major weekly magazine showed a photo from I'm Too Sad to Tell You with the caption, "Vol artist Ader, a sob story." It went on to describe the artist as a sentimental loser, a romantic softie, a problem case, and not even original at that. It was this review that prompted the horrified Bas Jan to never speak about his work again. I remember clearly how as immigrants, the likes of Bas Jan and myself had always hoped to become heroes back home. But it didn't always work that way. My old friend Frans Bromet, the unhappy overgrown toddler in one of our early films, arrived in Los Angeles one day to make a documentary about my Hollywood existence.
Zijn we aan het filmen?
He decided to show that the reality of Hollywood was much less glamorous than the people at home expected it to be. I showed Frans the dilapidated MGM backlot, where I was shooting some random scenes of a fake movie I had made up for the occasion.
Laten we eens kijken wie de beste film maakt, hè? Vind je dat?
Hey.
Wat is dit?
Wat? Ik zie niks. That's Karl Struiken, another Dutch refugee, who would go on to play Lurch in the Addams Family.
Hij is wel even voor de
I think
gek.
it's a nice action picture, this one. We're really going to get it in a can.
Touch my daughter, huh?
To provoke the Dutch audience, I staged some outrageous scenes set at the plantation, in which a slave gets whipped by his master for having seduced his fair-skinned daughter.
Teach this guy a lesson, I'm telling you.
Unfortunately, the joke backfired on me, as most Dutch viewers were appalled and readily mistook our mockumentary, absurd as it was, for the portrait of a loser filmmaker who had lost his way in Hollywood. So much for Dutch irony.
Al! Daddy! Oh, shit. The scene needs to be more violent. It's got no violence in it. It's lukewarm.
The problem was, this disconnect with the culture we came from troubled us much more than we were willing to admit.
Renee, can't you even watch while we're making your baby? My God.
It was as if the umbilical cord with our native country had been permanently cut, and it hurt. I know the same to be true for Bas Jan Ader, whose work seemed to be increasingly informed by an overwhelming sense of loss. An entry in one of his notebooks reads, "The sea, the land, the artist have his great sadness known. They too will be no more." During his last trip to Holland, Bas Jan gave the Dutch one more chance to take him seriously as an artist. For 1 week, he showed up every day in his gallery in Amsterdam to read a story from Reader's Digest about a boy who plunged over Niagara Falls.
Its violence has always attracted daredevils. In steel drums or padded barrels, at least 7 stunters have gone over the horseshoe. Only 4 survived. Suicides find in the falls the savage end they crave. Dashed to the rocks below, thrust into wild eddies and currents, their broken bodies have almost invariably been cast to the surface at the Maid of the Mist landing exactly 4 days later.
At specific marks in the text, Bas Jan would take a sip of water, until both the story would end and the glass would be empty.
On Wednesday, July 13th, the body of Jim Honeycutt turned up at the Maid of the Mist landing. It was 4 days, almost to the hour, from the moment he was swept to his death.
The silence on the soundtrack underscores the fact that for most of the week, Bas Jan had been performing to an empty gallery. Back in America, life was rapidly becoming more desolate as well. His artistic output was at an all-time low, as if no longer there was inspiration to be found on land, were his thoughts that remained unsaid and his art that went unrecognized caused a growing disconnect with his surroundings.
I think that in the last couple of years he kind of pushed people away because I think he felt like, well, maybe I'm leaving, I don't want to have to say goodbye.
His attention was fleeting in all sorts of directions, and he must have been stretched to the limits, and I think he also was having affairs here and affairs there, tumultuous, turbulent marriage.
I got the book Open Marriage and had it around me, and I absorbed some of it through osmosis. Never read the damn thing, of course, but I thought about it.
He was always looked for secretive places and, talked to me about how fantastic Los Angeles was as a town, because it's so big that you could live like 2 different lives. Have one life for 3 days in some part of Anaheim and have another life in Pomona or in the valley.
One night in LA showed Bas Jan searching the city with a flashlight. Increasingly alienated from his friends and loved ones, he set out across the freeways, the backyards and the hillsides of Los Angeles. A lone figure in the night, making his way towards Land's End, where once again he found himself facing the sea. But the ancient light of the stars hinted at the past that kept haunting his mind. Just after the Second World War, when Bas Jan was only 2 years old, his mother wrote a book that must have made a deep impression on her son, and might finally provide us with a revealing glimpse into Bas Jan's creative process.
Is there no longer a place for the miraculous in this world? For most of us, it's as if Einstein were never alive. And when he tells us about matter that isn't really matter, but invisible galaxies of ions and electrons, we just smile incredulously. The majority of the people here are still stuck in the materialistic worldview of the 19th century.
The miraculous, invisible galaxies of ions and electrons. I couldn't help but wonder if years later Bas Jan's fall from the roof wasn't about a little boy testing Einstein's laws of gravity and matter, and all these other big ideas his mother had implanted in his young, impressionable mind.
While asleep, a person turns inwards, and our mind may roam far beyond the physical location of our sleeping bodies. We visit amazing realms, have miraculous experiences, and arrive at sudden insights. Like this planet keeps us bound to the Earth with its gravity, preventing us from getting lost in the infinity of the cosmos.
The mother's book goes on to describe Bas Jan's early life, when World War II was raging outside the safety of their home. Until one night, when Bas Jan's father was still in prison, the Nazis raided the Ader house, yelling,
"You've been hiding Jews in your house. You've half an hour. Gather your clothes." Immediately I started running through the house, grabbing what I could and throwing it out of the window because there was no time to pack. Coats, dresses, child stuff, underwear, whatever I could lay my hands on in a hurry. "That's enough!" shouted Herr Oberleutnant when the time was up. Then I was shown out of my house, where the soldiers of the new order were getting ready to pillage and plunder everything in sight.
Decades later, her son would make all my clothes, which appeared to be inspired by the mother's recounting of the incident. And here's a letter Bas Jan's father sent to his mother from prison.
I'll tell you some other time about the exact circumstances of how I got caught by 3 men with guns shouting, "Hands up." But now I am in prison. I've never been closer to God. It was just very hard for me to resign myself to delivering the lives of you and the children into his hands as well. I guess it has to be that way. It's just that you're getting attached to earthly things. But I am sure God will help me surrender myself to him once more. Whatever the outcome, we will be seeing each other, either here on earth or later up there.
Overcoming the attachment to earthly things, surrendering oneself to the hereafter. For Bas Jan's parents, the material world clearly took a backseat to the spirit realm. And the larger-than-life heroic father he knew only from his mother's exalted words seemed to have a direct line to God, the creator of light and darkness, he who giveth and taketh away, and calls upon us when our time has come.
The door slammed shut and the car holding my husband took off. It was a grey and misty day. At around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, the car stopped at the forest of Achterberg. The pale light of dusk was giving way to darkness. The loud voices of the German soldiers were the only sounds disrupting the silence. The trees of the forest stood like the columns of a cathedral. A short order was shouted, then shots rang out, and the mouth that had just spoken its final blessing was silenced forever.
Decades later, his son would make an untitled photowork, in which he himself would take a fall in the forest, along with the trees which at once stood motionless like the columns of a cathedral. Even Bas Jan's final masterpiece, In Search of the Miraculous, wasn't without precedent.
Early on in our marriage, my husband was suddenly overcome with a tremendous restlessness. I didn't understand. "What is it you want?" I asked him, as he seemed overcome with the same stirring that urges birds to migrate. "I want to go away," he answered, "far away." "Where to?" I asked. "I want to go to Palestine." "How do you plan to get there?" I asked him. "On my bicycle," he announced, and that's how he left the next day. On his bicycle, heading for Jerusalem.
Having survived disease, death and destruction, Bas Jan's father finally made it to the promised land, where he declared prophetically, "He who has tasted the water of the river Nile will forever long for it." "30 years later, halfway across the globe, the father's restless spirit carries over into his son once again, as he prepares to make a pilgrimage of his own in what would be the smallest boat ever to cross the Atlantic. 12 feet 6 inches to be precise. The work was to be in 3 pieces, a send-off in the stage by a choir of students singing the praises of the sea, to be followed by Bas Jan's solo crossing in a final attempt to go home, where he would receive a hero's welcome by yet another choir, standing by in Groningen.
I don't think that he expected not to make it. He didn't leave any long letter about what I was supposed to do. I never had a doubt in my mind that he wouldn't make it.
Fate makes no mistakes, you know. Whether he wanted to keep going or not was in the hands of fate.
I think he was actually looking for life in its bare essentials, mystical experience.
So suicidal. That's my conclusion. But Bas Jan certainly did it in an artistic manner, in an intellectual, philosophical way. So that's okay. But don't forget, I mean, I really was angry with the fact that he did that. I lost my best friend.
And yet we, 20 years down the line, are left with something that is extremely nourishing and important, but it's probably will never make sense to his generation, his family, and his friends. He believed in pilgrimage. He believed that going to sea was the only transcendental thing one had left. I mean, the sea is such a mercurial thing. It can save people as well as kill people.
Er is een moment wat iedereen meemaakt tussen leven en doodgaan. Dat moment kan niemand verklaren. En dat is maar een tiende van een seconde. En in die staat van genade kom ik als ik op zee ben. Ik wil dat moment lang vasthouden. Het is het vasthouden van hetgeen je loslaat. Ik denk dat hij daar steeds naar op zoek is geweest. Ik denk dat hij het heeft gevonden.
A few months after Bas Jan failed to return, a book was found in his locker at Irvine College. It was none other than The Strange Last Voyage of Donald Crowhurst, the sailor who forged his logbooks in an around-the-world race. The book describes Crowhurst's last days, and cracking up under the weight of his deception, he dropped out of the race. On board he had Einstein's theory of relativity, which prompted him to write his own theory of the universe. Upon having done so, he declared himself a cosmic being and threw his body overboard as the boat proceeded on its journey.
He solved it. He talks about, I have solved the secret of the universe, and therefore I have become a cosmic being. It was absolutely staggering for me to find out that Bas Jan Ader had thought about Crowhurst. He had thought about the disappearing and the sort of insanity. I mean, to have set out on that journey after having read this book is quite scary.
Bas Jan also took along a book for the journey, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, in which the German philosopher poses that reality is actually a big mind that is trying to figure itself out. According to the book, instead of intervening through his art, all Bas Jan had to do was to take to the ocean and participate in the truth. But Bas Jan was not just searching for the truth, he was in search of the miraculous. His mother's universe, where matter is not really matter, but invisible galaxies of ions and electrons. Crowhurst's immaterial world of cosmic beings. Henk de Velde's state of grace, or his father's hereafter. In short, the somewhere else that had always been just beyond his reach. All this must have been on Bas Jan's mind as he surrendered to the ocean, hurtling in free fall towards the unknown until fate would finally reveal itself. And so it is that Bas Jan Ader entered the realm of myth as he merged with the immensity of the sea, leaving it up to us who are left standing on the shore to guess as well we can at his thoughts unsaid and then forgotten.